Welcome back to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, and I hope you are having an amazing Easter weekend. Our next guest is one of our favorite people and the absolute one of the top best-selling authors, and it probably drives the New York Times crazy every time she does it again. Amity Shlaes is on with us. Amity, welcome back to the program. How are you doing?
Great, and I'm glad to be with you again.
Now, you've helped work on a program, on a new edition of the autobiography of Calvin Coolidge. Is the fascination with Coolidge because he's the only president that actually shrank government during his administration, or is there more to the story for the listener that will compel them to log in and get this?
Well, that's a pretty good start, because right now politicians tell us that it's impossible to shrink the government. If you'll notice when they're talking on TV, a lot of them will say that they reduced the increase in the growth rate of spending and pat themselves on the back for that. But how about a president who actually cut the government so the number was smaller and in peacetime, not just coming out of a war, but in peacetime? That was Calvin. In the 67 months that he served, term and a half, the government actually got smaller, never mind the population. And yes, that was in real terms. So, wow, that's a feat we say is impossible. They also said it was impossible then. There was a strong progressive movement at that time, just as there is one now. People were talking about socialism. The socialists were gaining votes in 1924 election when Coolidge had to run for office. The listener will know he came in 23 at the death of Warren Harding, but in 24, Coolidge had to run for office. The progressives gained over 16% of the vote with their own party, calling for all kinds of social democratic or outright socialist ideas. So you want to understand that Coolidge was under pressure. The era was under pressure. Free marketeers were under pressure then as now, and yet he did cut the government. And by the way, most people rewarded him for it. He won that election.
Well, talk about that pressure of that time, because that period of time, from about the beginning, the turn of that century into the Great Depression, with a lot of the world falling to collectivism, to socialism, Marxism, and America trying to fight its way, the union movement picking up steam, Teddy Roosevelt sort of trying to come up with an American version of the nanny state, if you will, and when Coolidge comes into office, why would he even think of this? What drove him to swim against that tide?
Well, that's a great question, because you often hear, particularly after trouble, that Republicans are supposed to go to the center, right?
Yeah.
So think of Gerald Ford after Watergate. He went to the center. The policies of the Ford administration weren't that different from the policies of the Democrats who preceded him. And that's just received wisdom now. Well, the Republicans are saying we got to get some of those center votes, so don't be extreme. Don't be like Barry Goldwater. What Coolidge did was he said, look, our platform from 1920 said taxation was a burden. We're going to stick to that platform no matter who the personnel is. He was president instead of Harding. And no matter what happened with Harding, Harding had a Scandal II teapot dome that actually besmirched the very private sector in which the party had placed so much faith in the 20 platform. Coolidge said, never mind, we'll do it better. And we will continue to try to do, we'll bend our energies, as he put it, to what the platform promised in 1920, which was tax cuts, smaller government, not a lot of what we would call entitlements, and there was pressure for entitlements. So he said, it was a wager that if you stick to doing what you said rather than accommodate what you perceive to be the political mood, people will respect you. And that is what happened with him. Americans saw give the experiment of the low tax regime time to work. It did in the mid-20s, and people saw that, and they said, well, maybe the party's right. And they kind of forgot about this Harding business. the whole Republican Party at that time was less about personality and more about execution on direct commitments to the electorate.
And when I talk to my friends, and believe me, in Central Virginia, it's hard to not walk down the aisle of a grocery store and not walk into somebody who believes their intellectual, merit outstrips that of a simple radio show host, and will tell me that, when we talk about Coolidge, and we do probably more frequently than a lot of radio shows, that he was really, the shrinking government was what brought on the Great Depression. But another one of your great best-selling books is The Forgotten Man and the untold history of the Great Depression. Is there any intellectual merit, aside from these professors from different Virginia universities that might have Virginia in its name, to connect Coolidge's smaller government to what led to the Great Depression?
No. So you just answered that, no.
I was going to say you want to go with that a little bit more, but, that's...
No, I would just be like Calvin and say no. Just because something follows something doesn't mean the first thing caused the second thing. Usually you learn about that fallacy in secondary school. You'll often find this coming from history teachers who are not that comfortable with economics and who treat the Great Depression as some kind of vengeance from God, right? Some kind of
punishment,
retribution.
Yeah.
And that might work nicely in a novel by F. Scott Fitzgerald, but it doesn't work in reality. The 20s were, by and large, a strong decade. They were a good decade for Americans. They helped poor Americans. People in the working class began to get cars. They began to get electricity, which completely changed the life at home. The number of hours a family would work on housework would go from 30 to 10 because of the washing machine, the light, the amount of free time you had. Having light at night really changed. And they got Saturday off. Saturdays off became closer to the rule in the 20s because of the productivity gains. It was a wonderful decade for the worker. So whether the Depression didn't have much to do with income distribution and poor be rich or inequality, so that's another fallacy. And we have a new issue at the Coolidge Quarterly. You can write our office. You can write Dean Ball, D-Ball at CoolidgeFoundation.org if you'd like a copy of the Coolidge Quarterly, but it's also online, where we debunk most of the arguments that Coolidge caused the Great Depression. I think people really like to attack Coolidge because they see he was so strong.
Well, and because he wasn't one of those figures, we're not immediately chiseling him onto Mount Rushmore, but because these dynamic characters, and you've written, and I love the phrase, the presidents should avoid great for their own good and the nation's, and your op-ed about, why presidents that shoot for servanthood often are the best ones and best remembered, too, rather than the ones that want to be this dynamic, transformative figure.
Oh, yeah. I mean, Coolidge was for incremental improvement. He said, well, let's try and get to good. Let's not worry about great. Let's just try and get to good, see if we can do that. Think of him as a used car salesman who under-promised and over-delivered. You go back to that salesman, right? As opposed to one who had a great website, but who charmed you online with his cool technology, but the car you got wasn't quite the car you hoped for.
Mm-hmm.
You go back to them, notwithstanding the website. Sometimes you don't because, they disappointed you. Coolidge was the other way, and what he really cheered people with, where he over-delivered despite his under-promising, was the economy. We had a wonderful economy in the 20s. It was not just a bubble, again, to go back to Gatsby, in a champagne glass.
Mm-hmm.
The 20s, yes, the stock market went too high. Okay, the stock market had gone too high any number of times, but without any old 10-year Great Depression. The Great Depression itself, well, I get into that in The Forgotten Man, and I want to thank the listeners who know the book and write me about it. But the Great Depression had a different cause every year. Recoveries are like people. They make decisions. And every year in the 30s, the Great Depression, the recovery had a different reason for choosing to stay away one more year. But by and large, I will go with the chief economist of Chase Bank from the period, Benjamin Anderson, who's way underread. He said, well, why did we have the Great Depression? The government played God. The government overstepped. And it's sort of like with the COVID crisis. When they tell you something, you're not quite sure they believe, and if they do believe it, they're wrong, and if they don't believe it, they lied to you, as in, say, the announcements about the use of masks at the beginning of COVID, or the idea that ventilators would save everyone. There's an erosion in trust when politicians promise something and butt in very intrusively with precise info that turns out to be wrong or misleading. That happened a lot in the 30s with the economy. They had some hokey ideas that we would even laugh at today in the 30s. So ask the professors in the aisle this. The New Deal believed that consumer choice impeded recovery. So that if people got to pick their chicken, or the equivalent of the 1930s equivalent of the latte, and said, well, I really want coconut milk, and I want it only half that, and by the way, could you add a little flavoring? Those people were impeding recovery by ordering slow. Well, imagine a national economic program on the idea that choice, consumer choice, slowed recovery. That was the centerpiece of the New Deal. Well, tell it all to Starbucks, right? A company entirely premised on the joy people take in making little choices about, like, what kind of milk they'll have in their coffee this morning. And tell that, so whatever is fashionable is the theory. Now we have modern monetary theory that says inflation never happens or something.
Okay.
Authorities are often wrong, and individuals often make better choices. That was the cause for the Great Depression in the 30s. That too much power aggregated by so-called experts who often did the exact opposite of what seemed right. There's another story about the Great Depression. In order to curtail supply, the Agriculture Department ordered farmers to have their mules kill crops, to step on the crops. And the little mules in Texas, for example, had been trained very carefully not to step on the crops, and the mules had trouble learning they were supposed to step on the crops because they couldn't understand why the farmer would get paid for crops they stepped on. And the mules had more common sense in that instance than the top agricultural economists.
Amity,
so there you are.
Amity Shlaes is on with us, best-selling author, co-editor of the new edition. It's the autobiography of Calvin Coolidge, one of her best-selling books. And, you described the 30s, and as you were going through, and The Forgotten Man was the cornerstone of President Trump's election. I think he may have lost sight of it by the time, and maybe it was the badgering of the left that just kept him away from connecting again with the Forgotten Man as he did in 16. But you really tell us about the 30s in a way that sounds so familiar to what's going on right now, Amity. I know it's 100 years since Coolidge, and we think in terms of 100-year cycles, but really it seems like we're recreating the 30s right now as we in poverty, we struggling to make ends meet, look to some superhero to come flying in through the window and put the bad guys, whoever they may be, behind bars. Is there hope that we, the people, snap out of this, or is it going to have to get a lot worse before it gets better from where you sit?
Oh, there's always hope we snap out of this. Remember, in the 30s, they thought basically socialism was the answer, and they thought all Americans would go along, too. Sometimes it takes a rude experience to make you snap out. Think of Margaret Thatcher in Britain. Well, how did Lady Thatcher get elected? Well, they had to have a purgatorial economy first. How did Reagan get elected? Same thing. So the hope is that common sense allows us to slow down in our progressive efforts before we have major economic trouble. Because the 70s, for example, another book I've written is Great Society, and I hope that the listeners will have a look at that book. It wasn't great. It's an ironic title, description of the 1960s. And the 70s were the price we paid for the for the overreach of the 60s. It's a tragic story because the 70s just plain weren't necessary. We brought the 70s on ourselves. We made it wasn't just foreign competition. The foreign competition succeeded, for example, in the auto industry because we rendered our own auto industry uncompetitive. We murdered personally Flint and Detroit by making everything they made too expensive. And Americans found they could buy Toyota. So there it was. But that was the naivety, the vanity of the automakers and the unions, who can do a lot of damage.
And especially when they get together and start to, whether they knew it or not, they were bringing that on. An agenda that was really born out of the idea of keeping the black or sating the black communities that were rioting at the time. And I bring it up frequently just to annoy people. How's that working for you here in 2021 while the black communities are still rioting and still saying, hold it, 50 years later, where are the jobs? And I think that gives rise to the democratic socialists of today, Amity, is that, now failing to hear anything but Democrats come into the poor communities, now the democratic socialists have fertile soil to grow in.
Yeah, I mean, the epigraph of Great Society is nothing is new, it is just forgotten. That is one reason such ideas can be popular now is people don't remember the 60s so well. But what was sad about the 60s, when you think about fatal choices or important choices of the United States, what we could have said is, let's have a national program and ensure that every disadvantaged child, black or white, can do trigonometry. And we all have plenty of faith that most Americans can do trigonometry. Some do trigonometry a little more slowly than others, or it takes 2 courses instead of 1. So what? Let's spend $10,000 a kid and be sure they know trigonometry and make sure they want to know trigonometry. We didn't do enough of that. Instead, what we did was, even through the courts, make benefits property, create entitlements. The listeners may not remember, but entitlements weren't always called entitlements because you weren't entitled to them always. Sometimes there was the discretion of a social worker, as witchy as that could be. There was a point to that. When entitlements become property, and I'm thinking here of a case called Goldberg v. Kelly, where the court talked about that, then, of course, anyone, black or white, will want to hold on to that property. Tom Sowell, the famous economist, wrote a wonderful letter to the papers in the period and said, well, African Americans are just like anybody else. If you tell them they're entitled to get something, well, then they'll focus on claiming it. So I think the fatal error of the Great Society was to emphasize the transfers to the disadvantaged rather than the opportunity for the disadvantage. And we're living with the consequences of that today.
Is the political, and I sometimes go after them because they're an easy target, the political consultant class, that's the ones who generally will tell a conservative, don't go into that neighborhood, it's a waste of your time, come here, let's gin up the base, and the Democrats do them as well, just let's talk to the base, let's not talk to everybody. Is this creating more of the problems that we saw, that we have seen again 100 years, and as you said, nothing is forgotten, nothing is new. It's just been forgotten from the last time we did it.
Well, the base is sentient, and if you appeal to the spiritual in a man, and Coolidge said that, or a woman, man is a spiritual nature, and to service in him and to opportunity in him, then you'll get an individual who's interested in service and opportunity. That's what we failed to do. In a way, we failed to show respect to other Americans by failing to recognize they're just like the rest of us, by dumbing down everything. Once I was teaching in a high school in Arizona, and one of the students got up and said, "Sounds like you're not for food stamps. You're shaming food stamps. I'm on food stamps. How can you shame me?" And my reply was, and it would be now, no one shames anyone who's come to want. People come to one all the time in unexpected circumstances. We need to help one another. If food stamps are the answer, well, let food stamps be the answer. But recognize, one, that food stamps have often been powered by the agricultural lobby, so you're just a tool of the agricultural lobby. Sometimes if you're, their goods are sold, right, they're for food stamps, and they make money. But two, that we all agree that while it's no shame to be poor or to need food stamps, that it would be a shame to expect not only us, but our children and grandchildren to be on food stamps. No one wants his or her grandchildren to be on permanently on food stamps. Nobody's happy about that idea. They want their grandchild to be leading in an office, on a factory floor, in the field, to be able to feed his or her family. Everyone wants that, and that's the shame. It is a shame that we've created a society where that's all too likely. Third, fourth generation, and we've let those people down. That is where we've let people down.
Well, with that, unfortunately, we have run up against our cruel mistress, the clock on the wall. AmityShlaes.com is the website. Please check out the new edition of the autobiography of Calvin Coolidge. It's been an honor again having you on the program, Amity, and have a wonderful Easter weekend.
It's wonderful to be on, and I hope people will look at the Coolidge autobiography, which we've re-edited very lovingly, not changing a word, I should mention, Holy Coolidge writings, but with footnotes, timelines, so you can share Calvin Coolidge with your children. It's the one with Coolidge throwing a baseball, if you're looking on Amazon, but you can also buy it on the Coolidge Foundation website, coolidgefoundation.org, Coolidge's autobiography.
So much. Thank you, Amity Shlaes, and we'll talk to you again very soon.
Thank you.
And thank you for listening. For all of us here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy, my name is Joe Thomas. You can find archives of all these shows on our YouTube channel. Search Freedom and Prosperity Radio. And until next weekend, for all of us, happy Easter and so long, and thanks for all the fish.